All right, guys, this video is probably long overdue. It's a specific study on how to paint metallic surfaces. Colors I used are raw sienna, burnt sienna, cadmium orange, titanium white, and Mars black. But like I've said all along, based on the color temperature, you could use similar colors and probably get similar results. There's lots of different paints out there with different names, and in essence, they do the same thing. They are different, but you have to know how to treat them, right? And I didn't use that much cadmium orange, truly, but I did use it. So I mean, it's fair to have it in there. As always, you're going to start by priming the canvas. You could prime with burnt sienna on this one. I think it might be a little bit better and faster for that table surface. I'm just so used to priming with gray that I primed with gray here. And you should start drawing. I recommend getting used to drawing with your brush. And you can see it's very loose, and I'm using relational proportion to draw, which is imperfect. I'm also not using it properly, so things aren't perfect. But you've heard me say it time and time again. If it's not a face, then you're pretty good standing. It doesn't have to be perfect. Because people see faces, people recognize faces, and they can tell when something is off on a face. But this is a metallic teacup or teapot. And people aren't so intimately, keen on what teapots look like. So you could get away with extending something here or shortening something there. And on that same token, there are many different styles of teapots. So for this particular one, you could just use relational proportion and try to have fun and be loose with it. Also, something to consider is that your reference is not the same size as your canvas. So you can see that the fabric is different. Yeah, I could have made it a little bit more accurate, like that piece of fabric all the way to the left is more vertical. But fabric, just like the teapot, it's fabric and it changes. So it's not that big of a deal. As per usual, make sure that you're including your shadows. We typically work from the shadows to then the midtones to then the highlights. Oh, and talking about the fabric, in many ways, this is a fabric study as well. I don't think I've really done anything with fabric yet. This is probably the first thing. And it takes a lot of working and reworking. One of the reasons I decided to do these individual items in these videos is because too often I give a lesson and the student is gone or works on it for, 10 minutes, and they come back and say, I'm done. And it's hard for me to explain that you're not done because in their mind or in your mind, you truly may very well be done. But there's so much that you have to do. So I needed to do these videos to make sure that you're hitting all of the points or that you have some guidance on all of the points that I expect you to. So the table surface right there is just raw sienna, and the edge of the table, or the edge that's facing us, is a burnt sienna, but burnt sienna would still be too bright for that. So in this painting, I'm darkening with black and I'm lightening with white, and that burnt sienna I darken with my black to get it to be the right value. One thing that makes metal look like metal is that it tends to be highly reflective. And it's likely that before doing this lesson, you've done my how to draw texture assignment, where you have to do a spoon and you have to do a bottle and all of that. This is the same as that in the sense that this teapot is reflecting a room. Oh, before I get carried away, you'll see that I'm trying to put the grain of the table in there, and you see that I wipe the brush quite often. So I flatten the brush to create the grain, and then I'll wipe the brush to make sure that enough paint is out of it so I could soften those lines. And even so, that line right there was a little bit too harsh, but I softened it. And right along the edge, I'm going to soften that too. If you notice in the reference image, there are like little nicks taken out of the table. I do include that, but I include it later. One thing that is important when you are painting is to try to take advantage of the paint that's in your brush. That's super relevant here because you've used this orange to paint the table, and now that same orange is reflected inside the teapot. My professor always taught me, even though I wasn't the best student, perhaps I'm still not, but he taught me that the reflections should be a little bit duller than what they are reflecting. So the idea being that that reflection inside the pot shouldn't be as strong as the actual table. I don't think I did a good job in making that. So I think that the table and my reflection are the same, and they are because I just used the same paint. It's time to start working on the background. And in the background, you see that I'm kind of blocking it in. I didn't realize it at first, but the truth is it could have had a little bit more of a tint of red. So it looks a little pink is what I'm saying. And that is probably true even all the way through to the end. But I didn't have any red, as I showed you the colors that I used in the beginning. And I hesitated to get red because I showed you those colors in the beginning. I did end up using a little bit of burnt sienna, and I think I got something that was passable, but not quite the same, but that's okay. For the purposes of the study, if you get to a level where it's passable, would be acceptable. I put the initial color in, and you see this is where I start to change it so it's got more of a, in my case it would be that orangey tint, and I think that works. If you notice, I'm not being super careful so as to not paint into the pot that I've drawn. That initial drawing is just a placeholder, right? So you kind of know where things are, but you shouldn't be too afraid to get up in there because the rule is you draw from the back forward. So you draw the background, you draw the middle ground, and then you draw the foreground. So if I get into that, I can paint over it later and reshape it. But I can't do it in reverse. Like you can't do the foreground first, and then the middle ground, and then the background. So typically you want to do it this way, and if you get into the edge of your pot or whatever it is you're doing, don't overthink it because it can be reworked later. So as far as the background is concerned, I'm trying to get the value right. I'm trying to make sure that it's dark where it needs to be dark, that it's light where it needs to be light, right? And remember that you do that by blurring your vision. There, I wiped my brush on camera just as a reminder to you that I'm doing that pretty regularly. And I did that right there specifically to show you that I was trying to blend out the paint that I had applied to the canvas. Now, with oil paint, this process of blending is phenomenally easier, better, because this acrylic paint that we use in class, it dries very quickly. So you have to work very quickly. And that can be good because it teaches you how to work quickly. You see right there, that's a dry brush technique. So I put a little bit of burnt sienna into the brush, but it's not a ton. And I wiped most of it out and I'm kind of brushing it everywhere. And here you see me brushing it more to kind of get that tint that I was talking to you about in there because I wanted that in there. So yeah, still it's a process of working and reworking. I'm not good enough to get it all right on one go. So I have to work it and rework it. There's artists that are better that can do it faster because they get it right sooner. Even in the end, I'm not entirely sure I got it completely right. I do know that I made the pot feel metallic, which is what I'm aiming for. But here we go, darkening the values. If you had darkened the value right from the beginning, even me, I would have been able to save myself some time. And speaking about time, this video is sped up like most of my videos are because I can't for the life of me get you to watch it if it's not sped up. So it is sped up. This pot took me about 3 hours. That would be 2 class periods for you. I typically, I always give you guys more time than it takes me. So I think if I expect these results, 3 class periods should be a good amount of time. 4 class periods is more than enough. Still working those shadows, midtones as well, making sure that that little edge of the fabric shows because that's the highlight. It's how it all works. One doesn't work without the other. You can't make it all shadows or there'll be no three-dimensionality. Can't make it all highlights or the same thing. You need a balance. See, again, remember to shape your brush. Your brush is like a tool, a multi-tool. Depending on how you shape it, depending on how you use it, it can change. Right there on the edge, I made sure to strengthen the paint that I had in my hand or my brush so you could see that edge, right? So I added more white to it. That's how I did it in essence. But still working and reworking and softening and softening. Fabric is very soft. You shouldn't have any harsh edges. So I'll wipe the brush, I'll rub it, I'll rub the paint so it blends, so on and so forth. All right, the fabric is kind of in a place where I think it's acceptable, and it's time to start putting in that little pattern that you see there. My professor explained that you should be suggestive with your patterns, meaning add some of it with fidelity, add some of it with accuracy, but it doesn't all have to be exactly like it is in your photo reference. If you put some of the pattern in there, people understand that it has a pattern, right? And their brain will fill in the blank. Here I am adding more of that burnt sienna tone because I found that it wasn't quite colorful enough, the background. And again, you need to do that. When you do that, you do it with a dry brush, like I said, and a dry brush doesn't literally mean a dry brush. It means a brush with a little bit of paint in it. And it does help if the paint that you're doing it on is already dry. All right, so back to the pattern. The pattern, you'll see that there's areas even of the pattern that are darker than other areas. If I'm gonna do the pattern in the shadow, I can't use the same paint that I use in the highlight or in the lighter areas or the midtones. I need to darken that paint so it's visible. Likewise, whatever you use to create that pattern in the shadow, using it in a highlighted area might make the contrast of that area too strong. Okay? Snuck in a little happy face there. I don't know if you noticed, but it was fun. So again, it's not a very distinctive pattern, but the pattern is not the focus of the painting. So if you just put it here and there, it gives the viewer kind of a little something to look at, like a little snack to look at, a snack for the eyes, right? And in that spirit, you don't have to make sure that every single little spot is in the right place. And even when you're doing this on people, so if you're painting a person and the person has a pattern on their shirt, you don't have to make sure that every single little spot is there, right? The important spots, sure, but don't drive yourself crazy over that. It's not, helpful. There in that area, it's important to blur your vision and notice that there's some highlights in that area that show the transparency of that folded fabric. All right. I did have to touch that up a little bit. And of course, it's not really taking the same shape as the reference, but so be it. You have 20 people paint the same thing and you got 20 different images. And that's the pleasure of art. If you had 20 people painting the same thing, you might as well copy it in a copy machine. Here I changed the value of what I was using to create the patterns because you'll see that there's marks on the fabric that are a much lighter tone, and I wanted to include them as well. I don't know if I mentioned it, but I did switch to a fine brush. Uh, it should be obvious, but you cannot do this pattern with a broad brush. And I kept this fine brush for the remainder of the painting. Perhaps your brush doesn't have, excuse me, perhaps your brush doesn't have to be so fine, but it should be a fine brush. This is what I was discussing with you before. Now I'm going to go in and clean up the edges or kind of redraw. Excuse me, I need to clear my throat. All right. As I was saying, you need to redraw the edges, right? And all of that, all of the previous edges that you painted into, now it's time to bring them back with your brush. And if you're working on something that looks metallic, you don't have to worry because black is perfect to bring that back. Metal has this characteristic where it has very strong contrasts, very dark areas, very light areas. So bringing back those edges using a black is perfect because if it needs to be lighter, you go back in and you lighten it. And the black will cover the background, which is exactly what's happening here. And in some respects, this pot already looks metallic, but it's not quite there yet. And again, to make something look metallic, it needs to reflect to a degree. I want you to notice that though I am redefining the edges, I'm also taking advantage and using the black within the pot. There's areas of dark everywhere in the pot. Well, not everywhere, but in very specific places. And like I said before, you need to take advantage of the paint that you have in the brush. So when you're switching over, those areas that require that same color, you've already touched them. You really want to try to be careful when you're doing this part, because if you happen to slip and accidentally paint the fabric here or paint too much of the fabric, then you will have to go back in and touch that up. Like I said before, for practicality's sake or for efficiency, it's ideal to paint the background first, then the middle ground, then the foreground. But in this case, as I was saying, we're painting, well, this is kind of like the middle ground. We're painting the middle ground. So if you accidentally get into the background, then it's going to cover it and you're going to have to go back and touch up the background. That's not impossible. It's not an impossible thing to do, but it would require you matching color. So you would have to go back in. If I had made a mistake here, or a big mistake, I would have to go back in and match the color of the fabric. Now, I'm not using that many paints, so it's not that big of a deal. There are ways around this as well. So if your background is already dry and you make that type of mistake, you might be able to just pick up the paint that you made a mistake with, or dilute it enough to where it's not visible. At this stage, I'm pretty satisfied that with what I've done with redrawing or reshaping the edges, and I'm just going back inside to make sure that all of those dark areas are recognized, right? One thing I haven't done, and I will at the end of this or towards the end, is use some pure whites. Now, those pure whites are really going to take this over the edge and give it that metallic feel. But in the same way that we work from the back forward, typically we do shadows and then midtones and then highlights. So the highlights are the last thing you should be doing. Not always. It's just a rule of thumb, again, for efficiency's sake. So sometimes I do put in a highlight sooner than I normally would, or sooner than I should, just because I like the aesthetic or the feel of it. And the feeling is important. You have to want to paint. And so the thing, whatever you can do to kind of encourage the feeling to want to paint is something you should do. This that I'm going in with, that's not a pure white. All right, so when you're working on this, it's important you don't jump right into a pure white. This is more like a gray. And it might feel like a stronger white than it actually is because of the contrast. I'm putting it up next to black, so it feels like, hey, that's pretty strong. But it's really not. And you'll really see that once I do go in with a pure white and the difference between the two. I like to, again, I would say that this is that gray is like a mid-tone, getting ready for my highlight to sit on top of it. The highlight being the pure white. In the case of this thing, the roof, this is still not a pure white, but I did think it was too strong. So I did try to dull it a bit. So I got some darker color and I try to put it in there. Sometimes when I try to dull something, I'll also kind of rub it with my finger, trying to get some of the paint off. And also when you do that, it helps spread the paint and it helps it dry quicker. So when paint dries, it tends to dull a bit. But I did think it was too bright. See there, I'm going in with a darker value. And again, I'm just darkening with black, lightening with white, mixing black and white to create grays. And gray can take on the nature of any color. So I'd have like a gray mixed with raw sienna, a gray mixed with burnt sienna, and a combination of the two. I honestly I didn't use the cadmium orange too much. I did use it to intensify the raw sienna on the table a little bit and perhaps in the reflection and some of the highlights. There you go. You see, that was too strong. So I'm like dulling that down. Um, you only want a work to be strong where you want attention or the viewer's eye to be drawn, where you want attention, right? In the image. So usually when you're using a reference, you want that to be in the areas that are most highlighted. You don't want it to be in in a random place, you know? Um, but you could again blur your vision and see if it's matching. I'm not doing a perfect job of matching it here. I have gotten decent at it with experience, but honestly, while I was painting, I wasn't doing that quite enough. Um, but that is an excellent way to make sure that your values are correct. Here in the, I don't know what this is called, the stem or the spout. Yeah, the spout. I had to work it and rework it a lot. So because the highlights are so thin, I went in and I kind of did and you'll see that now in a moment. It's kind of a very spread out gray area. Um, and then I went back in with the black to redefine that area, kind of control it. Here I'm using, sometimes you'll see that I use my other hand to stabilize my painting hand. It is normal for for our hands to shake a little bit. So sometimes our hands do need that extra support just to stay steady. And especially when you're working on an area with some very fine lines like the spout, you're going to need that extra support. I thought it was interesting that there's there's like a little person there. I think that this reference is excellent and I used AI to create it. Um, Sometimes it's hard to find a reference and I couldn't find one. And it's also difficult to deal with copyright law. So I found lately that using AI to create very specific references is very useful. And sure enough, AI did put a little person in that little space, which is an open door or something. I wish I would have um, made that person more visible in my work, but maybe you can do that in yours. I thought it just adds an interesting, kind of creepy touch to it, but interesting still. Now it's time to go in with that pure white, and you'll see what a difference that makes. And again, to determine where that should go, just blur your vision and look at your reference. This will also be what my professor would call the dessert, kind of what wraps everything together. But in a more logical way, these bright areas represent windows in the room that's being reflected in this teapot or open doors. So it really helps when you think about it like that. It just makes more sense than a random white spot. And that window is may be reflected multiple times, like as the metal bends, and that's what you see happening there. This is what I was telling you before, how I kind of spread this gray everywhere. And then I went, there you go. That's how I spread it around, knowing that I needed to bring those things in, but also knowing that I would be able to go back in as I'm doing right now with the black to fine tune it, to control it, right? Using a little bit of that. That's probably a little bit of that cadmium orange just to add more color to those specific spots. You should have a little highlight on the table. Admittedly, the highlight on my table could have been a little bit stronger, but I'm not completely dissatisfied with it. I like to add a little highlight on the edge of the table as well. It's a technique from the master Chardin. If you've done any of the master studies, I think that the edge of the table is a little bit more highlighted. And then also here, you'll see how I added those notches. Now, by now, this paint is mostly dry. So you see, you can start with a little highlight, right, where those notches are, because those areas pick up a little bit more light. And then do a little shadow in there. And then you could do a stronger highlight, I believe. There you go. And that's how you do those little notches. Sometimes students will see that and they don't know how they're going to approach it, but it's really not as complicated as it looks. I needed to add like a light gray to that edge. And that spot I did, I feel, was maybe a little bit too strong. But maybe I just left it. Another thing I tell my students is remember when you're displaying work, not that this work is really meant to be displayed. Some people do like still lifes like this, but I think it's these types of still lifes are mostly learning exercises to teach you how to paint metal. But when you're displaying work, your reference isn't going to go up next to it. So a little difference here, a little difference there isn't going to make or break your artistic career. Now, if you are painting a person, then the reference is walking around typically. So that's why when you do portraits, you have to be much more careful with your measurements. I'm happy I did this one. I feel like it's gonna help you guys learn a lot about painting metal. And I think it produced a great little result, a great little painting here at the end. I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys could do. This video's about done, you guys. So again, I look forward to seeing what you got in class. I did decide to add a bit of a strong highlight on the handle right there at the end where I put that brush mark. You'll see right now in a moment, but it wasn't really necessary, but I thought, well, I'll just add a little strong highlight right here. All right, guys, I'll see you in class. Bye.